A reading from Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Chapter 11, The Totalitarian Movement, Section 1, Totalitarian Propaganda. Only the mob and the elite can be attracted by the momentum of totalitarianism itself. The masses have to be won by propaganda. Under conditions of constitutional government and freedom of opinion, totalitarian movements struggling for power can use terror to a limited extent only and share with other parties the necessity of winning adherents and of appearing plausible to a public which is not yet rigorously from all other sources of information. It was recognized early and has frequently been asserted that in totalitarian countries, propaganda and terror present two sides of the same coin. This, however, is only partly true. Wherever totalitarianism possesses absolute control, it replaces propaganda with indoctrination and uses violence, not so much to frighten people. This is done only in the initial stages when political opposition still exists as to realize constantly its ideological doctrines and its practical lies. Totalitarianism will not be satisfied to assert in the face of contrary facts that unemployment does not exist. It will abolish unemployment benefits as part of its propaganda. Equally important is the fact that the refusal to acknowledge unemployment realized about bids in a rather unexpected way. The old socialist doctrine, he who does not work shall not eat. Well, when, to take another instance, Stalin decided to rewrite the history of the Russian Revolution. The propaganda of his new version consisted in destroying, together with the older books and documents, their authors and readers. The publication in 1938 of a new official history of the Communist Party was the signal that the super purge, which had decimated a whole generation of Soviet intellectuals, had come to an end. Similarly, the Nazis in the Eastern occupied territories at first used chiefly anti-Semitic propaganda to win firmer control of the population. They neither needed nor used terror to support this propaganda. When they liquidated the greater part of the Polish intelligentsia, they did it not because of its opposition, but because, according to their doctrine, Poles had no intellect, and when they planned to kidnap blue-eyed and blonde-haired children, they did not intend to frighten the population, but to save Germanic blood. Since totalitarian movements exist in a world which itself is non-totalitarian, they are forced to resort to what we commonly regard as propaganda. But such propaganda always makes its appeal to an external sphere, be it the non-totalitarian strata of the population at home or the non-totalitarian countries abroad. This external sphere to which totalitarian propaganda makes its appeal may vary greatly. Even after the seizure of power, totalitarian propaganda may address itself to those segments of its own population whose coordination was not followed by sufficient indoctrination. In this respect, Hitler's speeches to his generals during the war are veritable models of propaganda, characterized mainly by the monstrous lies with which the Führer entertained his guests in an attempt to win them over. The external sphere can also be represented by groups of sympathizers who are not yet ready to accept the true aims of the movement. Finally, it often happens that even party members are regarded by the Führer's inner circle or the members of the elite formations as belonging to such an external sphere. And in this case, they too are still in need of propaganda because they cannot yet be reliably dominated. In order not to overestimate the importance of the propaganda lies, one should recall the much more numerous instances in which Hitler was completely sincere and brutally unequivocal in the definition of movement's true aims, but they were simply not acknowledged by a public unprepared for such consistency. But basically speaking, totalitarian domination strives to restrict propaganda methods solely to its foreign policy or to the branches of the movement abroad for the purpose of supplying them with suitable material. Whenever totalitarian indoctrination at home comes into conflict with the propaganda line for consumption abroad, which happened in Russia during the war, not when Stalin had concluded his alliance with Hitler, but when the war with Hitler brought him into the camp of the democracy, the propaganda is explained at home as a temporary tactical maneuver. As far as possible, this distinction between ideological doctrine for the initiated in the movement who are no longer in need of propaganda and unadulterated propaganda for the outside world is already established in the pre-power existence of the movements. The relationship between propaganda and indoctrination usually depends upon the size of the movements on one hand and upon outside pressure on the other. The smaller the movement, the more energy it will expend in mere propaganda. The greater the pressure on totalitarian regimes from the outside world, a pressure that even behind iron curtains cannot be ignored entirely, the more actively will the totalitarian dictators engage in propaganda. The essential point is that the necessities for propaganda are always dictated by the outside world, and that the movements themselves do not actually propagate but indoctrinate. Conversely, indoctrination, inevitably coupled with terror, increases with the strengths of the movements of the totalitarian government's isolation security from outside interference. Propaganda is indeed part and parcel of psychological warfare, but terror is more. Where the rule of terror is brought to perfection is in concentration camps. Propaganda disappears entirely. It was even expressly prohibited in Nazi Germany. The Nazis did not strike at prominent figures as had been done in the earlier wave of political crimes in Germany, the murder of Rathenau and Erzberger. Instead, by killing small socialist functionaries or influential members of opposing parties, they attempted to prove to the population the dangers involved in mere membership. This kind of mass terror, which still operated on a comparatively small scale, increased steadily because neither the police nor the courts seriously persecuted political offenders on the so-called right. It was valuable as what a Nazi publicist has aptly called power propaganda. It made clear to the population at large that the power of the Nazis was greater than that of the authorities, and that it was safer to be a member of a Nazi paramilitary organization than a loyal Republican. This impression was greatly strengthened by the specific use the Nazis made of their political crime. They always admitted them publicly, never apologized for excesses of the lower ranks. Such apologies were used only by Nazi sympathizers and impressed the population as being very different from the idle talkers of other parties. The similarities between this kind of terror and plain gangsterism are too obvious to be pointed out. This does not mean that Nazism was gangsterism, as has sometimes been concluded, but only that the Nazis, without admitting it, learned as much from American gangster organizations as their propaganda, admittedly learned from American business publicity. More specific in totalitarian propaganda, however, than direct threats and crimes against individuals, is the use of indirect, veiled, and menacing hints against all who will not heed its teachings, and later mass murder perpetrated on guilties and innocents alike. People are threatened by communist propaganda with missing the train of history, with remaining hopelessly behind their time, with spending their lives uselessly, just as they were threatened by the Nazis with living against the eternal laws of nature and life, with an irreparable and mysterious deterioration of their blood. The strong emphasis of totalitarian propaganda on the scientific nature of assertions has been compared to certain advertising techniques, which also address themselves to masses. And it is true that the advertising columns of every newspaper show this scientificality, by which a manufacturer proves with facts and figures and the help of a research department that his is the best soap in the world. It is also true that there's a certain element of violence in the imaginative exaggerations of publicity men, that behind the assertion that girls who do not use this particular brand of soap may go through life with pimples and without a husband, lies the wild dream of monopoly, the dream that one day the manufacturer of the only soap that prevents pimples may have the power to deprive of husbands all girls who do not use his soap. Science, in the instances of both business publicity and totalitarian propaganda, is obviously only a surrogate for power. The obsession of totalitarian movements with scientific proof ceases once they're in power. The Nazis dismissed even those scholars who were willing to serve them. And the Bolsheviks used the reputation of their scientists for entirely unscientific purposes and forced them into the role of charlatans. But there is nothing more to the frequently overrated similarities between mass advertisement and mass propaganda. Businessmen usually do not pose as prophets, and they do not constantly demonstrate the correctness of their predictions. The scientificality of totalitarian propaganda is characterized by its almost exclusive insistence on scientific prophecy, as distinguished from the more old-fashioned appeal to the past. Nowhere does the ideological origin of socialism in one instance and racism in the other show more clearly than when their spokesmen pretend that they have discovered the hidden forces that will bring them good fortune in the chain of fatality. There is, of course, a great appeal to the masses in absolutist systems, which represent all the events of history as depending upon the great first causes linked by the chain of fatality, and which, as it were, suppress men from the history of the human race. In the words of Tocqueville, but it cannot be doubted either that the Nazi leadership actually believed in and did not merely use as propaganda such doctrines as the following: the more accurately we recognize and observe the laws of nature and life, so much the more do we conform to the will of the Almighty. The more insight we have into the will of the Almighty, the greater will be our successes. It's quite apparent that very few changes are needed to express Stalin's creed in two sentences, which might run as follows. The more accurately we recognize and observe the laws of history and class struggle, so much the more do we conform to dialectic materialism. The more insight we have into dialectic materialism, the greater will be our success. So Stalin's notion of correct leadership, at any rate, could hardly be better illustrated. Totalitarian propaganda raised ideological scientificality in its technique of making statements in the form of predictions to a height of efficiency of method and absurdity of content, because demagogically speaking, there is hardly a better way to avoid discussion than by releasing an argument from the control of the present and by saying that only the future can reveal its merits. However, totalitarian ideologies did not invent this procedure, and we're not the only ones to use it. Scientificality of mass propaganda has indeed been so universally employed in modern politics that it has been interpreted as a more general sign of that obsession which has characterized the Western world since the rise of mathematics and physics in the 16th century. Thus, totalitarianism appears to be only the last stage in a process during which science has become an idol that will magically cure the evils of existence and transform the nature of man. And there was indeed an early connection between scientificality and the rise of the masses. The collectivism of masses was welcomed by those who hoped for the appearance of natural laws of historical development, which would eliminate the unpredictability of the individual's actions and behavior. There has been cited the example of Infantino, who could already see the time approaching when the art of moving the masses will be so perfectly developed that the painter, the musician, and the poet will possess the power to please and to move with the same certainty as the mathematician solves a geometrical problem or the chemist analyzes any substance. And it has been concluded that modern propaganda was born then and there. Yeah, whatever the shortcomings of positivism, pragmatism, and behaviorism, and however great their influence on the formation of the 19th century brand of common sense, it is not at all the cancerous growth of the utilitarian segment of existence which characterizes the masses to whom totalitarian propaganda and scientificality appeal. The positivist conviction, as we know it from Comte, that the future is eventually scientifically predictable, rests on the evaluation of an all-pervasive force in history and the assumption that objective laws of power can be discovered. Rohan's political theory, that's the king's command, the people's and the interest commands the king. So that objective interest is the rules. That alone can never fail. That's rightly or wrongly understood. The interest makes governments live or die is the traditional core of modern utilitarianism, positivist or socialist, but none of these theories assumes it is possible to transform the nature of man as totalitarianism indeed tries to do. On the contrary, they all implicitly or explicitly assume that human nature is always the same. That history is the story of changing objective circumstances and the human reactions to them, and that interest, rightly understood, may lead to a change of circumstances, but not to a change of human reactions as such. Scientism in politics still presupposes that human welfare is its object, a concept which is utterly alien to totalitarianism. It is precisely because the utilitarian core of ideologies was taken for granted that the anti-utilitarian behavior of totalitarian governments, their complete indifference to mass interest, has been such a shock. It's introduced into contemporary politics an element of unheard of unpredictability. Totalitarian propaganda, however, although in the form of shifted emphasis, indicated even before totalitarianism could seize power how far the masses had drifted from mere concern with interest. Thus, the suspicion of the Allies that the murder of the insane, which Hitler ordered at the beginning of the war, should be attributed to the desire to get rid of unnecessary mouths to feed, was altogether unjustified. Hitler was not forced by the war to throw all ethical considerations overboard, but regarded the mass slaughter of war as an incomparable opportunity to start a murder program which, like all other points of his program, was calculated in terms of millennia. Since virtually all of European history through many centuries had taught people to judge each political action by its cui bono and all political events by their particular underlying interests, they were suddenly confronted with an element of unprecedented unpredictability because of its demagogic qualities. Totalitarian propaganda, which long before the seizure of power clearly indicated how little the masses were driven by the famous instinct of self-preservation, was not taken seriously. The success of totalitarian propaganda, however, does not rest so much on its demagoguery as on the knowledge that interest as a collective force can be felt only where stable social bodies provide the necessary transmission belts between the individual and the group. No effective propaganda based on mere interest can be carried on among masses whose chief characteristic is that they belong to no social or political body and who therefore present a veritable chaos of individual interest. The fanaticism of members of totalitarian movements, so clearly different in quality from the greatest loyalty of members of ordinary parties is produced by the lack of self-interest of masses who are quite prepared to sacrifice themselves. The Nazis have proved that one can lead a whole people in a war with a slogan, or else we shall go down, something which the war propaganda of 1914 would have avoided carefully. And this is not in times of misery, unemployment, or frustrated national ambition. The same spirit showed itself during the last months of a war that was obviously lost when Nazi propaganda consoled an already badly frightened population with the promise that the Führer, in his wisdom, had prepared an easy death for the German people by gassing them in case of defeat. Totalitarian movements use socialism and racism by empty the member of the utilitarian content, the interests of a class or nation. The form of infallible prediction in which these concepts were presented has become more important than their content. The chief qualification of a mass leader has become unending infallibility. He can never admit an error. The assumption of infallibility, moreover, is based not so much on superior intelligence as on the correct interpretation of the essentially reliable forces in history or nature. Forces which neither defeat nor ruin can prove wrong because they are bound to assert themselves in the long run. Mass leaders in power have one concern which overrules all utilitarian considerations: to make their predictions come true. The Nazis did not hesitate to use, at the end of the war, the concentrated force of their still intact organization to bring about as complete a destruction of Germany as possible in order to make true their prediction that the German people would be ruined in case of defeat. The propaganda effect of infallibility, the striking success of posing as a mere interpreting agent of predictable forces, has encouraged totalitarian dictators the habit of announcing their political intentions in the form of prophecy. The most famous example is Hitler's announcement to the German Reichstag in January 1939. Quote, "I want today once again to make a prophecy in case the Jewish financiers succeed once more in hurling the peoples into a world war. The result will be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." Unquote. Translated in a non-totalitarian language, this meant, I intend to make war and I intend to kill the Jews of Europe. Similarly, Stalin, in the great speech before the Central Committee of the Communist Party in 1930, in which he prepared the physical liquidation of intra-party right and left deviations, described them as representatives of eigen classes. As soon as the execution of the victim has been carried out, the prophecy becomes a retrospective excuse. Nothing happened but what had already been predicted. It does not matter whether the laws of history spell the doom of the classes and their representatives, or whether the laws of nature exterminates all those elements. Democracies, Jews, Eastern subhumans unmentioned, or the incurably sick that are not fit to live anyway. Incidentally, Hitler too spoke of dying classes that ought to be eliminated without much ado.